Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're not really looking at the usual political drama. We're focused on something much bigger, more fundamental for North America.
A huge strategic shift.
Exactly. A massive shift in continental economics.
Yeah.
We're exploring what happens when the very framework that supports, over $1 trillion in trade?
$1 trillion a year, yeah.
When that framework, the USMCA, is suddenly treated as, optional.
Not as a given.
For months, the pressure coming out of Washington on Canada was just tightening and tightening. And our sources show this wasn't happening through, say, traditional diplomacy.
Oh, not at all.
It was through, and I'm quoting here, altered language, sharpened warnings, and remarks that carried significantly more weight. It was a very deliberate turn.
And that's such a critical starting point. The whole dilemma really became official when the U.S. Trade Representative just openly stated it.
Stated what, exactly?
That Washington was prepared to step away from, or at the very least, fundamentally rework the entire USMCA. And this wasn't framed as just a negotiating tactic. Analysts were calling it a declaration of preparedness.
A declaration. So the message was stark.
Incredibly stark. It was basically the economic integration we've built for decades. We're willing to dissolve it if it doesn't perfectly align with our evolving priorities.
That framing must have changed the climate immediately, not just in diplomatic circles, but in corporate boardrooms, I'd imagine.
Instantly.
So the mission today is to really analyze the unintended consequences of that. The pressure was meant to force Canada into alignment, right?
That was the goal.
But did it instead expose some serious vulnerabilities in the U.S. strategy? And maybe more surprisingly, did it actually push Canada toward an unexpected level of economic strength and autonomy? That's what we want to look at.
The ripple effects across the whole continent.
Okay, so let's detail that initial shockwave, because the threat alone must have been massive.
Oh, it was.
We're talking about the USMCA, an agreement that is the literal foundation for an economy that oversees $1 trillion in trade annually.
And it's not just the money, it's the supply chains. These are deeply integrated, woven together over generations.
Right, so even suggesting it could all be dismantled, that signals you're willing to disrupt the entire North American manufacturing and agricultural system.
It's an enormous strategic gamble, and the language they used was really key to understanding how serious it was.
How so?
Well, the tension really escalated when President Donald Trump just amplified the message. He said plainly that Canada would face significantly more pressure.
And analysts picked up on the tone of that immediately.
They did. They described it as unusually blunt. It sounded more like, the language you'd use for domestic bargaining, not the careful wording of international diplomacy.
So this wasn't just standard trade friction.
No, this was a signal that relations were entering a deliberately abrasive phase.
And Washington didn't just stop at threats, did they? There were specific pressure points that made this all feel very real.
Very real.
First, there was that open discussion about breaking the USMCA into two completely separate deals, one with Mexico, one with Canada.
Precisely. And even if that was just a theory, it directly attacks the whole concept of a unified North American economy.
It's an attempt to fragment the system.
And then it went beyond just trade mechanics. You had the U.S. ambassador raising these really significant concerns about Canada's internal political advertising laws.
Right, which on the surface seems like a domestic issue.
It is a domestic issue. The U.S. was arguing that these Canadian regulations had implications far beyond their borders.
And Ottawa's response was what?
They firmly rejected it. They argued it was a clear overreach into sovereign domestic policy. And that disagreement, that core argument, it just slowed everything down at a really sensitive time.
So if you look at history, the expectation would be what? That Canada, facing this immense pressure from its biggest partner, would eventually have to give in, right?
That's the familiar pattern, absolutely. To avoid massive economic disruption, you concede.
But what's so fascinating here, and what we're going to get into, is that's not what happened.
Not at all. They chose to hold firm.
That decision to not back down, that's where this story gets really interesting. Canada chose a fundamentally different, and you have to say, much riskier path.
It was a huge risk.
So, faced with all this uncertainty and escalating rhetoric, Canadian leaders adopted a much firmer public stance. The Minister of Industry actually said they were prepared to meet the pressure head-on.
And that phrase, meet the pressure head-on, it wasn't just talk. It was backed by a pretty significant intergovernmental strategy.
What did that look like?
They announced this close, coordinated planning with business leaders, labor groups, provincial governments. The message was very clear.
We're getting ready.
Exactly. Canada was preparing to adjust, not to retreat. And the financial results of that resolve, I think they stunned a lot of analysts.
And the data really tells the story here.
Yeah.
An assessment from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it noted Canada's remarkable resilience.
Remarkable resilience, yeah. And that was despite this huge looming threat of tariffs or even a full collapse of the trade agreement.
And that resilience, it wasn't just an idea. It translated into actual capital, right? Money flowing in.
Directly into capital inflow. We saw foreign direct investment, FDI, it surged by nearly $78 billion.
78 billion.
Yeah, which pushed the total investment close to $1.5 trillion. And here's the critical part. This inflow was centered on future-facing industries.
Like what?
Clean energy, critical minerals extraction and processing, and advanced EV battery manufacturing.
So not just propping up old industries. This was investment in the future.
Precisely. And this performance just far exceeded anything Washington seemed to anticipate when it started this whole pressure campaign.
But that's the core question, isn't it? How did they manage that? How did they achieve that sudden strength when, by all conventional logic, they should have been weakening under that pressure?
The key was a really comprehensive strategic overhaul. It was driven by the private sector, but it was also, facilitated by a sense of stability from the government.
And what was the overhaul?
Canadian firms fundamentally restructured their supply chains. It was a massive shift.
Okay, let's pause there and explain that. When you say restructured their supply chains, what does that practically mean for our listeners?
It's not just switching one supplier for another. It's about creating what they call parallel supply chains.
Parallel supply chain. So two tracks running at once.
That's it. It's incredibly complex, and it requires deep investment. It means a company might have one system for sourcing parts and logistics that's optimized just for the U.S. market under all the USMCA rules.
Okay.
But at the same time, they're setting up an entirely separate track sourcing, logistics, compliance that's tailored to meet, say, European or Asian standards.
Leveraging other trade deals like CETA with Europe.
Exactly. It's expensive at first, but it acts like an insurance policy. If the U.S. border suddenly slams shut with tariffs, that second supply chain keeps running. Business continues.
And we saw this diversification strategy play out almost immediately in their trade numbers.
We did. You saw these channels that were once secondary, Europe, India, South America, they suddenly became central pillars of their strategy.
So industries that had long been totally reliant on the U.S. market started diversifying at a speed nobody really predicted.
And the energy sector is a perfect, really striking example of this. Just look at oil production from Newfoundland and Labrador.
What's the story there?
More than half of its output now goes to Europe.
More than half.
Yeah. That is a dramatic, fundamental shift from where things were just 2 decades ago. And this wasn't just a business decision.
It was geopolitical.
It was a deliberate geopolitical choice. Europe was looking for dependable, stable energy suppliers after all the instability elsewhere, and they turned to Canada. Canada basically leveraged its stability to solve its vulnerability.
So the pressure that was designed to weaken Canada, instead, just nudged it. It nudged it toward maximizing its global stability and repositioning itself as this stable base for EVs, for clean energy, critical minerals.
Right. And now Europe and Asia, they see Canada as a highly reliable source, a stable entry point into Western markets, specifically because its policy environment is less volatile than its southern neighbors.
Which brings us to the core irony of this whole deep dive.
It really is an irony.
If we connect all these dots, the outcome looks nothing like what Washington originally intended. While Canada was defensively adjusting and strengthening,
Cracks were becoming more and more visible south of the border.
the strategy that was designed to assert all this leverage, it seems to have had some really significant, corrosive, unintended consequences at home.
It does, and you can see it in the data.
So what did that domestic economic instability in the U.S. actually look like?
Well, it showed up most clearly in the manufacturing numbers. We saw U.S. manufacturing activity decline for 9 consecutive months leading into late 2025.
9 months.
9 straight months. That was the longest downturn of its kind since the global financial crisis.
And this wasn't just some abstract number on a chart. Specific sectors felt this, right?
Oh, absolutely. Major transport equipment producers, we're talking heavy machinery, aerospace parts, they announced pretty significant layoffs.
And started moving operations.
Moving operations overseas. And when these companies spoke publicly, they were explicit. They cited the need for a more predictable policy environment.
saying that the constant threat of tariffs and trade deals collapsing just made it impossible to make long-term investments in the U.S.
Exactly. The risk was too high.
We also saw it on the consumer side, with clear signs of strain.
We did. Cyber Monday sales, which are always a huge indicator of how confident households are feeling,
Right.
they only rose slightly, which signals that American families were getting much more cautious. Rising costs, the threat of tariffs, which is really just a tax on imports, it was all weighing on their budgets.
And then the corporate resistance, it went from just complaining to actual legal action.
A very powerful move. It came from major retailers, with Costco really leading the charge.
What did they do?
They launched a significant legal action seeking reimbursement for all the tariff-related expenses they'd incurred under these policies.
Oh, that's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. If they're successful, it opens the door to potentially massive financial liabilities for the government. It's a signal that corporate America is pushing back, and pushing back hard.
So that legal challenge, it basically says that this uncertainty is now being seen as an active liability on the balance sheet.
Absolutely. And the critical analysis of capital movement confirms the whole story. Investment analysts reported that big funds started to categorize the United States as a higher risk policy environment.
So money started moving.
Capital that once just flowed effortlessly into U.S. markets began shifting. It started looking for jurisdictions that offered clearer rules, more stability. And yes, Canada emerged as a direct strategic beneficiary of that reallocation.
They were being labeled a lower risk policy environment.
That's the term they used.
But let me ask a critical question there. The U.S. capital markets are enormous. Is the scale of that capital flight really significant enough to make a dent? Or is this more of a symbolic shift for now?
It's both. The volume itself might not shake Wall Street tomorrow morning, but the type of capital is what really matters. We're talking about long-term, sticky infrastructure investment. The money you need to build advanced battery plants, critical mineral refineries, automotive factories.
Foundational money.
Foundational money. When that kind of capital goes elsewhere, it signals a long-term erosion of your manufacturing base's competitive advantage. It's a fundamental statement about future trust in the U.S. policy structure.
Okay, so we have Canada, strategically firmer, more diversified, capitalizing on its stability. Meanwhile, the U.S. is facing these domestic downturns and corporate lawsuits. So let's look ahead. Where does this leave the current political tightrope walk?
Well, despite all the obvious friction, the diplomatic maneuvering does continue. We just recently saw the U.S. ambassador try to ease tensions a bit by stressing that Washington has no interest in interfering in Canadian domestic politics.
But at the same time, that same ambassador was also pointing to Canadian political messaging being broadcast in the U.S. as proof that, the boundaries are already blurred.
Right. And the situation gets even more complicated because he admitted that the U.S. strategy document allows for, quote, broad interpretation.
Which just fuels more scrutiny.
Of course it does. That phrase, broad interpretation, is exactly what worries former diplomats. The lack of clear, narrow assurances leaves way too much room for unilateral policy shifts.
Which, ironically, just validates Canada's whole strategy of diversification.
It completely validates it. It confirms that the U.S. is not offering the stability its partners require.
And the road ahead, it has a very clear deadline. The USMCA is set for a major review next year in 2026.
That's the big one. And consultations are already underway. All sides are preparing their negotiating positions for what will be a truly pivotal moment for the continent.
But the high-level dialogue, it is still happening, despite the tension.
It is, and that's critical. We know Prime Minister Mark Carney met with President Trump and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum at that recent international gathering.
Right.
They held extended talks. They publicly committed to continued cooperation. So it signals that despite the harsh rhetoric and the strategic repositioning, the basic infrastructure for dialogue is still there. It's still functional.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? What started out as this campaign of pressure to enforce alignment has really transformed, hasn't it?
Completely. It's a high-stakes test of strategic endurance now, with all these unintended consequences.
And Canada's defensive diversification, which was fueled by capital just looking for a safe harbor, it has inadvertently created a real competitive advantage.
By reducing its reliance on its single, unpredictable partner.
Which raises the big question that really defines this whole deep dive for us.
Has the attempt by the United States to assert maximum leverage, has it instead given rise to a stronger, more economically self-reliant competitor right next door?
The evidence seems to suggest that stability in today's geopolitical world might be the most valuable commodity of all.
And Canada is now selling it globally.
So a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the United States were to, theoretically, just exit the USMCA framework entirely in 2026,
Which is still on the table.
analysts are now openly discussing the possibility that Canada could successfully reposition itself as the major, low-risk manufacturing and stable supply chain hub for all of North America.
Think about that. Think about the strategic implications of Canada attracting all that global auto, aerospace, and mineral capital that's fleeing U.S. policy volatility.
It would completely rewrite the continental trade playbook. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Go forth and be well informed.